What the? Dude, hold!
A terrifying creature surfaced in the Ho River on October 9th, 2016. A fisherman fled the waters in terror, leaving behind torn-apart gear and footprints too massive to belong to any human. The physical evidence left behind was so disturbing that even investigators struggled to explain what his rod had hooked. Mark Halperin had chosen that bend in Ho River for good reason. The current slowed there, creating a deep pool where bottom feeders like to congregate after dark. Mark had been fishing these waters for the better part of 15 years, ever since moving to Port Angeles for work. The first cast landed where the water deepened into a dark pool. The 80-pound braided line was overkill for most river fishing, but Mark had learned to appreciate its strength after losing too many big fish to lighter tackle. After 20 minutes, a slight tug on the line brought Mark's attention back to his rod. He said that at first he thought it wasn't a fish, probably just the current pushing his weight against some underwater obstruction. But Mark lifted the rod and felt weight, not the dead pull of a snag, but something with substance and resistance. Mark felt his pulse quicken as he prepared for what might be a significant fish. But what happened next would replay in Mark's mind for the rest of his life. The weight on his line suddenly intensified, not with the gradual increase typical of a feeding fish, but with a shocking, immediate force that nearly tore the rod from his hands. The power was immense, steady, and strangely purposeful. Not the erratic runs and jumps typical of a hooked salmon, but something that seemed to be testing the limits of his equipment with deliberate intent. Mark braced his feet against the rocky shore and leaned back, trying to gain some leverage against whatever was on the other end of his line. The drag continued its high-pitched whine as the line disappeared from his reel at an alarming rate. He'd stated that he started the evening with nearly 200 yards of backing, but at that rate, he'd be down to the spool in minutes. But the movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Mark found himself holding a rod, bent nearly double, the line taut as a guitar string, connected to something that had simply decided to stop moving. He tried to pump the rod, working to regain some line, but whatever he'd hooked remained absolutely motionless. It was like being connected to a submerged car. Then the movement resumed, but now it was different. Not the steady pull of before, but a series of short, powerful jerks that sent shockwaves up through the rod and into Mark's arms. Each jerk was followed by a brief pause, as if whatever was on the other end was testing different angles or approaches. The pattern was too regular, too methodical to be the random struggles of a hooked fish. Mark's lantern flickered as a gust of wind moved through the trees, casting dancing shadows across the water. In that brief moment of shifting light, he thought he saw something break the surface near the far bank. Not the silver flash of a fish, but something dark and substantial that disappeared before he could focus on it. The line went slack. Mark reeled frantically, expecting to find his hook straightened or his line broken. But as he retrieved the slack, he felt weight again, not the dead weight of a snag, but something moving slowly through the water toward his position. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever he'd hooked was swimming directly toward him. This was the moment when Mark's 15 years of fishing experience became irrelevant. Every instinct told him that fish didn't behave this way, that nothing in the river should be able to generate the kind of sustained power he'd just experienced. But the evidence was undeniable. Something large and strong was connected to his line, and it was approaching his position with what seemed like deliberate intent. The water near the bank began to roil and churn as something large moved just beneath the surface. Mark could see the disturbance clearly in his lantern light, a V-shaped wake that suggested something swimming with purpose rather than struggling against a hook. The wake was too large, too organized, too directed to be anything he recognized. What could be strong enough to move like that? Mark's hands began to shake as he continued to reel, no longer trying to fight whatever was on his line, but simply responding to its approach. The rod remained bent, the line tight, but now he was following rather than leading. Whatever was down there had taken control of the situation, and Mark was beginning to understand that he was no longer fishing. He was being fished. The churning water moved closer to shore, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of what he'd hooked. What he saw in that moment would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the natural world. The hook was embedded in thick, matted fur, covering what was unmistakably a forearm. Not the sleek hide of a river otter or the coarse coat of a bear, but something that belonged to no animal Mark had ever encountered. The fur was dark, almost black in the lantern light, and hung in heavy, waterlogged clumps that dripped river water back into the current. Embedded throughout the matted coat were fragments of vegetation, pine needles, moss, small twigs, as if the creature had been moving through dense forest before entering the water. But it was the arm itself that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. The proportions were wrong for any known animal, too long and too heavily muscled, with a structure that suggested both immense strength and surprising dexterity. The forearm alone appeared to be nearly 3 feet in length, covered in that strange, thick fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lantern's glow. Mark's fishing rod remained bent in a deep arc. The 80-pound braided line stretched taut between his reel and whatever was attached to his hook. The tension remained constant, as if the creature was simply allowing itself to be connected rather than fighting to escape. This passive acceptance was perhaps more unsettling than any struggle would have been. Why wasn't it pulling away? The water continued to churn as more of the creature became visible. Mark caught glimpses of a massive torso, broad shoulders that seemed to span an impossible width, and what appeared to be another arm moving beneath the surface. The scale was overwhelming. This was not just large, but enormous in a way that challenged his ability to process what he was seeing. Then the eyes appeared. He said that 2 points of reflected light caught the lantern's beam and held it, staring directly at Mark from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. They were positioned too high above the water, too far apart, and too intelligent in their focus to belong to any animal he knew. Was it assessing him as prey or something else? Mark found himself frozen, rod still in his hands, staring back at those reflected eyes across the dark water. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body seemed incapable of movement. He said that the creature remained motionless as well, as if both man and beast were locked in a moment of mutual assessment that neither was prepared to break. The smell hit him then. He described a complex mixture of wet fur, river mud, and something else, something wild and organic that he couldn't identify. The odor was so strong and distinctive that Mark knew he would recognize it instantly if he ever encountered it again. The creature began to move toward shore with deliberate, powerful strokes that sent waves lapping against the rocky bank. Mark could see more of its form now, the massive head and shoulders, the incredible breadth of its chest, the way it moved through the water with an efficiency that spoke of both strength and familiarity with aquatic environments. This was not an animal that had accidentally fallen into the river, but one that was completely at home. Had he stumbled onto a creature evolved for both land and water? As it approached the shallows, the creature's full size became apparent. Even partially submerged, it was clear that this was something of extraordinary proportions. Easily 8 feet tall, possibly more, with a body mass that Mark estimated at well over 400 pounds. The way it moved suggested that every ounce of that weight was functional muscle, built for power and endurance rather than speed. The creature reached the shallows and began to rise from the water. Mark watched in fascination and terror as it revealed its full form, water cascading from its massive frame like a primordial emergence from some ancient world. The torso was barrel-shaped and incredibly broad, covered in the same dark matted fur that hung in heavy clumps. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to what would have been knee level on a human, with hands that appeared both massive and surprisingly articulated. But it was when the creature stood to its full height that Mark truly understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The thing towered above the riverbank, easily 9 feet tall, its head nearly lost in the shadows above the lantern's reach. The proportions were simultaneously human-like and utterly alien, familiar enough to be recognizable, strange enough to be terrifying. How could something so humanoid exist undiscovered? The creature examined the fishing line that connected them, following it with its eyes from Mark's rod to where the hook was embedded in its forearm. There was no sign of pain or distress, only what appeared to be curiosity about this unexpected connection. Then, with a movement so casual it seemed almost dismissive, the creature reached across with its free hand and grabbed the braided fishing line. Mark watched in disbelief as those massive fingers closed around the 80-pound test line, meant to hold the biggest fish in the Pacific Northwest, and snapped it as easily as breaking a twig. To put it in perspective, that line was designed to handle the pull of a full-grown grizzly bear's swipe if it were hooked on it. But this creature did it with one hand, without any effort. The sound was sharp and final, like a small whip cracking. Mark's rod straightened instantly, the sudden release nearly knocking him backward off his log. He stared at the loose line hanging from his rod tip, then back at the creature, which now studied the broken end with what seemed like casual curiosity. Later, it hit him. Nothing alive, he knew, could combine that kind of raw strength with such careful, deliberate control. The line hadn't frayed or stretched. It had simply been cut in one effortless motion. What kind of animal could do that? But in the moment, Mark was focused entirely on the creature itself, which had now turned its full attention to removing the hook from its arm. He watched as those enormous hands worked with surprising delicacy, grasping the hook's shank and working it free from the matted fur with careful, precise movements. There was a brief flinch, the first sign of discomfort the creature had shown, as the barbed point pulled free, but no sound of pain or distress. The creature examined the hook for a moment, turning it over in its palm as if studying this strange artifact from the human world. Then it looked directly at Mark, and in that moment of eye contact, Mark said he felt something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The unmistakable sense that he was being evaluated by an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, primitive and sophisticated. The vocalization that followed was unlike anything Mark had ever heard. It began as a low rumble, so deep that he felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity and travel through his bones. The sound built gradually, taking on harmonic overtones that suggested a complex vocal apparatus capable of producing sounds far beyond the range of any known animal. The rumble evolved into something that was almost speech-like, a series of modulated tones that carried clear emotional content even though Mark could not understand their meaning. There was no aggression in the sound, no threat or challenge, but rather something that seemed almost conversational, as if the creature was attempting to communicate something important. Mark tried to speak, but only a stammered gasp escaped him. Would it even recognize him as a being worth responding to? The creature tilted its massive head at the sound of his voice, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of its face in the lantern light. The features were undeniably primate-like, but scaled up to proportions that seemed impossible. The brow ridge was pronounced and heavy, shadowing eyes that reflected the light with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth wide and expressive. The creature made another vocalization, softer this time. According to him, it was almost questioning in tone. It took a step closer to the bank, and Mark could see the water streaming from its massive frame, pooling at its feet in the rocky shallows. The movement was fluid and controlled, showing no sign of the awkwardness that might be expected from such a large creature moving from water to land. Mark's analytical mind, trained by years of observing wildlife behavior, noted details that would later prove crucial to investigators attempting to understand what had occurred. The creature's gait was distinctly bipedal, with a stride length and foot placement that suggested a being perfectly adapted to walking upright. Its balance was excellent, showing none of the forward lean or knuckle-walking posture associated with known great apes. He later told investigators that, at that moment, he was thinking that he caught Bigfoot with his fishing rod. The creature reached down and picked up a smooth river stone, examining it briefly before setting it aside. The gesture was casual, almost absent-minded, but it demonstrated a level of manual dexterity that was remarkable for hands of such size. Mark could see that the fingers were long and articulated with what appeared to be opposable thumbs. Was it planning something or simply playing? Another step brought the creature to the very edge of the water, close enough that Mark could see individual droplets falling from its fur. Close enough that the wild, organic smell became almost overwhelming. The creature was now less than 20 feet away, well within the circle of light cast by the lantern, and Mark could observe details that would be burned into his memory forever. The fur was not uniform in color or texture. While predominantly dark brown or black, there were patches of lighter coloration around the face and chest, and areas where the fur appeared to have been worn thin by contact with vegetation or rough surfaces. The overall impression was of a creature that lived entirely in the wild, with no contact with human civilization or domestication. Then the creature did something that would change Mark's understanding of what he was witnessing. It reached down and picked up another stone, this one larger and more angular than the first. But instead of examining it and setting it aside, the creature drew back its arm and hurled the stone into the forest with tremendous force. The sound of the stone crashing through branches and undergrowth was followed immediately by a response, another vocalization, similar to the one the creature had made, but coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The creature called again, a complex series of tones that carried clearly across the water, and was answered by what sounded like at least two other voices from different directions in the forest. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. This creature was not alone. There were others out there in the darkness, others that were now aware of his presence and the unusual situation unfolding on the riverbank. The thought of multiple creatures of this size and apparent intelligence moving through the forest around him was almost too terrifying to contemplate. How many were watching him right now? Then it stopped and stood motionless in the shallows. Mark said that the dim light caught the glint of its eyes, fixed and unblinking, as if weighing a decision. Every instinct in his body screamed to move, yet he couldn't. The creature's stillness was more terrifying than any charge could have been. The creature in the water made one final vocalization, longer and more complex than the others, and Mark had the distinct impression that it was providing some kind of report or explanation to its unseen companions. Then it looked directly at Mark one final time, and in that gaze, Mark said he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There was recognition there and evaluation, and what might have been a form of respect or acknowledgement. But he said that there was also something else, something that spoke of vast intelligence, of a being that understood far more about the world than Mark had ever imagined possible. The broken fishing line hung limply from his rod tip, one of the few physical evidences that the encounter had been real, rather than some elaborate hallucination. But Mark knew with absolute certainty that what he had experienced was genuine, that in front of him, from the depths of the whole river, this creature of impossible proportions had examined his hook, evaluated his presence, and chosen not to strike, but not to leave either. Little did he know, that night wasn't about to end in peace. The silence that followed the creature's continued presence was more unsettling than any sound could have been. His mind struggled to process what he had witnessed, cycling between rational explanations that fell apart under scrutiny and the impossible truth that something beyond current scientific understanding had just examined him with obvious intelligence. Then came a sound, soft, deliberate footfalls from the tree line behind him. Another shape shifted in the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered like the first, and then another beside it. Their silhouettes were barely distinguishable, but unmistakably upright, their eyes catching faint glimmers of light. They weren't hiding anymore. He was reminded of his vulnerability. He was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road, with only a small circle of light protecting him from whatever else might be moving through the darkness. The realization was no longer just a thought, it was visible. 3 of them now stood beyond the riverbank, unmoving, half shrouded in mist. One turned its head slowly, tracking his every movement. The air felt heavier, charged with something that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't curiosity anymore, either. Those same deep vocalizations he had heard during the encounter were now coming from multiple directions, not just those three. The sounds were not random or chaotic, but seemed to follow a pattern that suggested coordination and purpose. Mark had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the difference between animals moving naturally through their environment and the deliberate movement of creatures with specific intent. Whatever these creatures are, they're organized, and they were moving in a way that seemed designed to surround his position. But what happened to the peaceful encounter moments ago? Was that designed so he would lower his guard, or were there disagreements between those creatures? Mark's survival instincts finally overcame his paralysis. He began packing his gear with urgent efficiency, stuffing items into his tackle box and backpack without regard for organization. The lantern would have to stay lit until the last possible moment. The thought of being plunged into complete darkness while those things moved through the forest around him was unbearable. As he worked, Mark caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Large shapes shifting between trees just beyond the lantern's reach, always disappearing when he turned to look directly. The movements were too large and too coordinated to be bears or other known wildlife, and they seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance from his position, as if observing rather than approaching. The sound of breaking branches grew closer, and Mark realized that whatever was out there was no longer content to remain hidden. He could hear what sounded like deliberate tree breaking, not the random crack of dead wood falling, but the systematic snapping of living branches, as if something was clearing a path through the forest. The sounds came from at least 5 different directions, suggesting multiple creatures working in coordination. Could he outrun them, or was it already too late? Mark grabbed his lantern and held it high, trying to extend its circle of illumination as far as possible. In the wavering light, he caught his first clear glimpse of one of the creature's companions, a massive silhouette standing motionless between 2 large cedars, easily as large as the being he had encountered in the water. The figure was there for only a moment before melting back into the darkness, but it was long enough for Mark to confirm that he was dealing with aggressive creatures of extraordinary size and apparent intelligence. The realization that he was surrounded by unknown beings of such aggression triggered a primal fear response that overrode all rational thought. Mark abandoned any pretense of orderly packing and began stuffing essential items into his backpack with desperate haste. His truck was parked nearly a mile away along a winding forest trail, and the thought of making that journey through darkness while being stalked by creatures of unknown intent filled him with terror. Another sound froze him in place, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the ground itself. Mark realized that one of the creatures was striking something against a tree trunk, producing a deep, resonant sound that carried clearly through the forest. The rhythm was complex and deliberate, unmistakably a form of communication rather than random noise. The thumping was answered by similar sounds from other directions, creating a network of acoustic signals that surrounded Mark's position. The pattern was too sophisticated to be coincidental. These creatures could also coordinate their movements through complex signaling. Mark slung his backpack over his shoulders and picked up his tackle box, leaving only the lantern and his broken fishing rod. Then the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Mark could hear his own heartbeat. The sudden cessation of sound was more ominous to him than the communication had been, suggesting that whatever was out there had finished coordinating and was now ready to act. Mark knew that he could not afford to wait any longer. He kicked the lantern toward the water's edge, hoping that the sudden movement and change in lighting might create enough confusion to cover his escape. The lantern struck a rock and went out instantly. Mark heard a tremendous roar from somewhere behind him, a sound of such volume and fury that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Mark ran blindly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in his desperate attempt to reach his truck. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of large bodies moving through the trees, accompanied by more of those deafening roars that spoke of rage and perhaps frustration. The creatures were no longer attempting stealth. They were pursuing him with obvious intent. Were they hunting or just chasing him for sport? Branches whipped across Mark's face as he ran, and roots caught at his feet, sending him stumbling through the darkness, but he didn't dare slow down. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and he could hear the crash of undergrowth being trampled by creatures of enormous size and strength. A particularly loud crash from directly behind him spurred Mark to even greater speed. He could hear heavy breathing and the sound of large feet pounding against the forest floor, suggesting that at least one of the creatures was in direct pursuit. The thought of being caught by something of such size and apparent strength filled him with a terror that transcended rational thought. Mark burst through a stand of young alders and found himself on the familiar trail that led back to the logging road where he had parked. The packed earth felt solid and reassuring under his feet after the treacherous terrain of the forest floor, and he was able to increase his pace significantly. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had taken on a different quality, less frantic crashing and more purposeful movement, as if his pursuers had settled into a sustainable pace for a long chase. Heavy impacts echoed through the trees, rhythmic and coordinated. He could hear them spreading out, flanking him. The forest that had always felt vast now seemed to close in, every shadow filled with movement. Mark rounded a familiar bend and saw the blessed sight of his truck's reflectors gleaming in the distance. He fumbled for his keys as he ran, praying that he wouldn't drop them in his haste to escape. A deep guttural call rolled through the darkness behind him, answered by another closer to his right. The sound froze his blood. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Branches snapped just beyond the reach of his headlamp, something massive keeping pace with him at a terrifyingly steady speed. The truck's door handle felt like salvation under his trembling fingers. Mark threw his gear into the passenger seat and started the engine with shaking hands, not bothering with his seatbelt in his urgency to leave the area. The headlights illuminated the forest road ahead, creating a tunnel of light that led away from the nightmare he had just experienced. As the engine roared to life, a figure emerged from the brush to his left, taller than the hood, shoulders brushing the side mirror as it lunged forward. Mark slammed the accelerator, the tires spinning in the loose gravel before gripping. Something struck the rear panel with a deafening metallic thud, rocking the truck sideways. He sped down the narrow dirt road, headlights bouncing violently over ruts and potholes. In the rearview mirror, the beams of his taillights caught them. 3 silhouettes bursting from the tree line, sprinting upright through the dust. Their strides were unnaturally long, their movements fast and deliberate. One veered onto the road behind him, running straight down the center like a predator closing on prey. Another darted parallel to the truck, vanishing and reappearing between the trees, matching his speed. Mark's breathing came in short, panicked bursts as he took a sharp corner too fast, the truck fishtailing dangerously before he regained control. Gravel sprayed in all directions. He could hear them, heavy footfalls pounding against the earth, then another impact on the truck's tailgate. A deep dent appeared in the metal, visible even through the shaking red light of the rear camera. Something slapped the bed hard enough to rattle the toolbox inside. He floored the gas, the engine screaming, the forest whipping by in blurs of motion. For several unbearable seconds, the silhouettes remained visible in his mirrors, their glowing eyes locked on him, relentless. Then, as he hit the paved section near the highway turnoff, the shapes slowed. One stopped in the middle of the road, illuminated clearly in the receding taillights. A massive, dark figure standing upright, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely at its sides. 2 more joined it from the shadows, forming a silent line across the dirt road. None followed beyond the forest's edge. He left the site in silence, never returning to the Ho River, haunted by the memory of eyes in the dark.